Gideon Ashford, a solitary man in his late 30s, has always found solace in the ticking of clocks. It was the one constant in his otherwise tumultuous childhood, a sound that reminded him that time, no matter how painful the moment, would always move forward. But wasn't just any clock that fascinated him. It was the peculiar, the old, the broken, the ones that carried history, mystery, and perhaps a hint of darkness. This obsession with rare timepieces had led him to his most recent find, a grand, ornate wall clock, its face cracked, its hands eternally stuck at 11:55, and its wood carved with symbols too worn to decipher. Gideon was an antique collector by trade, specializing in restoring the forgotten relics of the past. His workshop was a labyrinthine collection of ancient artifacts, each possessing its own story, its own ghosts. The smell of varnish mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust, and the flickering bulbs overhead gave the space an eerie glow at night. Gideon often found himself there alone, long after midnight, surrounded by the tick-tick-tick of clocks in varying stages of disrepair. It was here, in the depths of his workshop, that he felt most at home and, strangely, most vulnerable, like the past was always watching, waiting. The clock that Gideon had recently acquired came from an old, dilapidated Victorian manor, a place shrouded in mystery. The manor, long abandoned and half-consumed by creeping ivy, was rumored to have a dark history. Local whispers spoke of the original owners, the Ashford family, Gideon's own ancestors. The story was that the patriarch of the family, Elias Ashford, had been found dead beneath that very clock, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wide open and staring at something unseen. Gideon, captivated by both the clock and the mystery surrounding it, brought the relic to his workshop, unaware of the shadows that followed. The clock was unlike any other. It stood tall, dominating the room, its brass pendulum dull with age, its carved casing adorned with unsettling engravings, figures that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of one's eye. The first night it entered his workshop, Gideon swore he heard faint whispers emanating from it, as if the wood itself carried the voices of the past. He dismissed it, attributing it to his tired mind and overactive imagination. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this clock, something that wasn't quite right. The manor where the clock had resided had an air of despair that clung to Gideon even now. In the safety of his workshop, he could still see the dusty, broken windows, the tattered curtains swaying though no wind passed through. And there, in the corner of the decrepit hall, had stood the clock, looming over everything, its silence almost a challenge, daring anyone to wind it, to hear it chime once more. Gideon accepted that challenge, believing it to be just another piece of history that needed restoring. But as midnight approached, and the shadows in his workshop grew darker, he began to sense that restoring this clock might awaken something better left alone. When Gideon brought it back to life, if only briefly, he felt the chills spread across his workshop, as if the temperature had plummeted. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound but presence, something heavy, pressing on his chest, filling the air with a thick, almost tangible dread. It was then that Gideon noticed the symbols carved into the wood, twisting patterns that seemed to change with every glance. They weren't just decorations, they were warnings, marks of something ancient and forgotten. He could feel it, even if he didn't yet understand it. Have you ever heard something that shouldn't make a sound suddenly spring to life in the dead of night? The question lingered in the darkness, just like the fear that had started to consume Gideon Ashford. He was alone in his workshop, surrounded by the ticking and talking of countless clocks, each out of sync, each with its own rhythm, as if they were attempting to communicate with one another. And then it happened, a sound that sliced through the cacophony, one he hadn't heard in years. The deep, resonant chime of a clock that should have remained silent forever. Gideon glanced up, his eyes locking onto the broken wall clock, the one from the Victorian manor. Its hands had moved, impossibly, clicking together at the stroke of midnight. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There was a coldness in the room now, like a spectral draft sweeping through his sanctuary, and with every passing second, the chill seemed to penetrate deeper into his bones. He could see his breath in front of him, misting in the dim light. The clock's pendulum, still covered in tarnish and grime, had begun to swing on its own, slowly, almost mockingly, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Suddenly, the chime came again, a deep, echoing gong that seemed to shake the very walls. Gideon felt his chest tighten, his heart thudding with an unnatural fear. The sound wasn't just a noise. It was a summons, a beckoning call from something beyond. His eyes darted around the room, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement. Shadows stretching and bending along the edges of his vision, figures just out of sight. He blinked hard, trying to clear his mind, but the feeling remained, a crawling sensation at the base of his spine, an instinctual knowledge that he was not alone. The lights in his workshop flickered, casting dancing shadows across the rows of clocks that lined the shelves. The ticking grew louder, a deafening crescendo, and Gideon could swear the clocks were no longer just measuring time. They were speaking to him, whispering secrets from the past. He strained to listen, his eyes fixed on the now moving clock, its hands slowly inching forward. His breath quickened as he heard something more than just whispers, an indistinct murmur, almost like a chant, a voice that seemed to echo from inside the very wood of the clock. It spoke his name, Gideon. The voice was faint but undeniable, carried by the resonance of the next gong. His blood ran cold, his hands trembling as he stepped closer, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. It was as if invisible strings were pulling him in, each chime tightening the hold, each echo dragging him deeper into an unknown darkness. The wood beneath the clock's face seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, and Gideon could almost see something beneath the carvings, a movement, a shape, something trying to get out. His rational mind screamed at him to back away, to leave, but his body refused to obey. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing the brass frame, when the clock let out one final gong, louder than before, resonating through the workshop. The world around Gideon seemed to ripple, as though reality itself had become unsteady, and for a moment he wasn't in his workshop anymore. The walls around him shifted, replaced by dark, endless corridors that twisted into impossible angles, lit by the faint glow of ghostly lanterns. A thick fog rolled across the ground, and in the distance, he could see figures, vague, human-like silhouettes standing still, watching, waiting. The chime ended, and Gideon was back, standing in his workshop, his hands still hovering over the clock. He staggered backward, gasping, his heart pounding in his ears. The room had returned to its former state, yet the feeling of wrongness remained. He glanced at the clock once more, its hands now perfectly still at 12, the pendulum frozen mid-swing. The silence that followed was heavy, an ominous quiet that pressed against his ears, and the only thought that ran through his mind was a question he didn't want to answer. What would happen when the clock struck 12 again? If you're just as intrigued and unsettled as Gideon is by the mysteries that cling to this haunted timepiece, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and keep those notifications on. You won't miss what happens next, because some clocks don't just tell time, they tell stories that should never be heard. The night after the clock struck 12 for the first time, Gideon drifted into an uneasy sleep, his mind clouded by the haunting resonance of that deep, echoing chime. He found himself in a dream, or what he thought was a dream, standing in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic and unsettling, like rust or blood. The workshop was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering, casting a sickly yellow glow. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, twist into unnatural shapes, as if trying to escape their owners. Gideon's gaze was drawn, as if compelled, to the wall clock. Its face was no longer cracked. Instead, the glass was pristine, polished to a mirror-like shine. He saw his own reflection, but there was something wrong. His reflection did not move as he did. Instead, it watched him with wide, hollow eyes, a twisted smile beginning to spread across its lips. The reflection's mouth opened, and a whisper slipped out, though the glass remained still, like a dark, mocking echo of his own voice. Suddenly, the room began to change. The familiar walls of the workshop warped, bending inward, then out, as if they were breathing. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing dark, rotted wood beneath, writhing with insects that scurried in and out of the gaps. The floor beneath his feet turned cold, ice cold, like he was standing on a frozen lake, the chill biting into the soles of his feet, creeping upward through his legs. He felt rooted, unable to move, as if some unseen force held him in place. The ticking started then, a cacophony of countless clocks, each one beating out a different rhythm. It became almost unbearable, a pressure building in his skull, and just when he thought he could stand it no longer, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Gideon could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, and a single sound broke the stillness: the low, rhythmic creaking of the pendulum. It swung back and forth, though now it was not brass, but something darker, something dripping, leaving stains on the floor beneath. His senses were overwhelmed. The acrid smell of burning wood filled his nostrils, and a faint, almost imperceptible chant began to echo around him, a chorus of voices speaking words he couldn't understand, but that filled him with an inexplicable dread. He turned, searching for the source, and found that he was no longer alone. In the corner of the room stood a figure, obscured by shadows, but the outline was unmistakable. Tall, imposing, with arms that hung too long at its sides, and a head that twisted, as if broken, to one side. The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, the workshop seemed to darken. Gideon tried to move, to back away, but his feet remained frozen, glued to the spot. The closer the figure came, the clearer it became. Its face, half hidden in darkness, seemed familiar, painfully familiar, like an old photograph he couldn't quite remember. It was his father, or something pretending to be. The eyes were empty sockets, yet Gideon could feel them staring deep into him, reading his fears, knowing his weaknesses. The figure raised one arm, pointing directly at the wall clock, which now struck again, a deafening gong that reverberated through Gideon's body, making his teeth chatter. He felt himself falling, the floor disappearing beneath him, and the cold turned to an unbearable, icy fire, burning him from the inside out. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The workshop was gone, replaced by the darkness of his bedroom, but the terror remained. His ears still echoed with that solitary chime, the memory of his father's hollow gaze seared into his mind. For a long moment, Gideon lay in the dark, struggling to catch his breath, feeling the walls of his bedroom press in on him, the echoes of the dream clinging to the edges of reality. He reached instinctively for his bedside lamp, but before his fingers could touch the switch, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible tick-tock coming from downstairs. The clock, the broken clock, was ticking once again, and with each tick, he could feel the dream clawing its way back to him, refusing to let go. The following night, Gideon, haunted by the memories of the dream, found himself unable to resist the pull of the workshop. It was midnight, and he stood before the broken wall clock, its face still as cracked as ever, yet somehow exuding an aura that seemed almost alive. He swallowed hard, the air thick with the scent of wax and something else, something acrid, like burnt hair. His fingers trembled as he reached out to touch the clock, feeling the cold, smooth glass beneath his fingertips. The moment he made contact, the world around him seemed to vanish. The workshop blurred, the edges of his vision darkening until only the clock remained, its hands spinning wildly, the pendulum swinging faster and faster, until suddenly it all stopped. Gideon found himself standing in a room he had never seen before. The walls were made of old splintered wood, covered in a thick layer of cobwebs, and the only light came from a flickering bulb that swung overhead, casting distorted shadows that danced on the floor. He could hear a faint dripping sound somewhere off in the distance, and a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a heart. He turned, and there it was, the clock. It stood in the middle of the room, impossibly large now, towering over him, its face twisted and distorted, the numbers rearranged into a pattern that made no sense. The hands were moving, ticking toward midnight, and with each second that passed, Gideon felt the floor beneath him begin to tremble. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, and the shadows grew darker, thicker, until they seemed almost solid, creeping along the floor toward him. Suddenly, the clock struck 12. The sound was deafening, a gong that shook the very air, and with each chime, the room around him seemed to change. The walls crumbled away, revealing a void of absolute darkness, and from that darkness came figures, dozens of them, their forms barely visible, like silhouettes carved from the night itself. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes glowing faintly, pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through Gideon's very soul. He could feel their gaze, their silent judgment, and with each step they took, he felt a cold dread settle deeper in his chest. One of the figures moved closer, and as it did, Gideon recognized the face, his father's, twisted, contorted in an expression of rage and pain. The eyes were empty sockets, yet they stared at him, accusing, and the mouth opened, releasing a whisper that echoed through the darkness. "Why did you let it happen, Gideon? Why didn't you stop it?" The words cut through him, filled with a hatred that chilled him to his core. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words would come. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy, and all he could do was stare, paralyzed by fear. The figures closed in, surrounding him, their whispers growing louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony of voices, each one echoing his deepest fears, his failures, his regrets. He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The shadows wrapped around his ankles, pulling him down, and the floor gave way beneath him, opening into a dark abyss. He fell, the cold air rushing past him, the voices following him down, growing louder and louder until they were all he could hear, until they were all that existed. And then, silence. Gideon awoke with a gasp, his body jerking upright. He was back in his bed, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. The room was dark, the air thick with the lingering sense of dread. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and there, in the corner of his room, he saw it, the clock. It stood tall, its face turned toward him, the hands frozen at 12. He stared at it, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he saw the shadows move, shifting along the wall, reaching for him. The clock let out one final, soft tick, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Gideon's gaze remained fixed on it, his mind racing. The dream had felt so real. The fear, the cold, the voices. They had followed him back, lingering in the corners of his consciousness, refusing to be forgotten. He knew now that this was no ordinary clock. It was something far darker, something that fed on his fear, something that would not stop until it had consumed him completely. And as he sat there, staring into the darkness, he realized that the real nightmare had only just begun. Gideon could no longer deny it. The clock had a power that transcended the boundary between dreams and reality. The next day, he stood in his workshop, staring at the wall clock, now ominously still, its hands motionless at midnight. He felt an unnatural fear bubbling inside him, a cold dread that made the room seem smaller, the air thicker. He knew he had to understand the truth about this artifact, its origins, its curse, if he had any hope of escaping its dark influence. Determined, Gideon began searching through the old documents and photographs he had acquired with the clock. Among the yellowed pages, he found something, a torn piece of parchment, scribbled with a shaky hand. It was a journal entry, dated decades ago, and the handwriting was hauntingly familiar, his father's. The words were smudged in places, but the terror embedded in the ink was palpable. The clock is a door. Each chime opens it further. Midnight is when it's here, when it takes you. I couldn't stop it. I can still hear them. Gideon's blood ran cold. The idea that his father had interacted with this same clock, faced the same terror, made everything worse. It wasn't just an old relic from a stranger's haunted past. It was part of his history, his family's legacy. He flipped through the pages, his fingers trembling, finding sketches of the the same symbols engraved in the wood now carefully drawn out, annotated with words like protection and binding. The deeper he delved, the clearer it became that the clock wasn't just any antique. It was an object of power, meant to be contained, never allowed to function again. A photograph slipped from between the pages, and Gideon picked it up with shaking hands. It showed the clock, pristine and new, in a different setting, his childhood home. And there, beside it, stood his father, looking far younger, but with an expression that sent a chill down Gideon's spine. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and his hand rested on the clock almost unwillingly, as if he was forced to touch it. Gideon's heart pounded as he remembered the stories his mother used to tell, the strange habits his father had adopted in the final years of his life. His obsession with clocks, his refusal to be near them after dark, his muttered warnings that everyone had dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind. Gideon turned his attention back to the clock itself, feeling a strange compulsion to get closer. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to move, to writhe under his gaze, and he could hear it again, the faintest whisper calling to him from beyond the surface. He leaned in, his breath catching as he noticed something he hadn't before. One of the symbols, partially hidden behind the pendulum, seemed incomplete, like it had been deliberately scratched out. His father's notes echoed in his mind, protection, binding, and a horrible realization dawned on him. The protection had been broken, the binding undone. The clock was free now, and it wanted something from him. Suddenly, a noise from behind made him jump, a soft, almost imperceptible ticking coming from across the workshop. Gideon spun around, his eyes searching the dim space. The ticking grew louder, echoing off the walls, but none of the clocks were moving. It was coming from nowhere, and everywhere at once, surrounding him. Panic rose in his chest as he realized that it wasn't just a sound. It was a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, matching his own, as if the clock had synchronized itself with him, tying its existence to his. Desperation overtook him, and Gideon tore through the workshop, scattering papers, overturning boxes, searching for anything that could explain what he needed to do. The ticking followed him, growing louder, relentless, until it was all he could hear. His eyes landed on an old mirror propped against a wall, and for a moment he froze. His reflection stared back at him, but just like in the dream, it was not him. It was smiling, lips curling into a grin that sent a shiver down his spine. The reflection raised one hand, pointing at something behind Gideon, and he turned slowly, dread coiling in his stomach. There, standing in the doorway, was the shadowy figure from his dreams, tall, dark, and featureless, but unmistakably there. It radiated a cold that Gideon could feel from across the room, and its presence seemed to pull the very light from the air, casting the entire workshop into a dim twilight. He could barely breathe, fear choking him, and he knew deep down that this was the entity his father had feared, the thing that the clock had been holding back. The figure took a step forward, and the clock behind him began to chime, the sound reverberating through his bones. With every chime, the world seemed to tilt, the walls of the workshop bending inward, the ceiling lowering, as though the space itself was collapsing under the weight of the clock's power. Gideon stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to stop it. He had to finish what his father had started, but he had no idea how. The symbols, the journal, the mirror, it was all connected, but the pieces refused to fit together, and time was running out. The clock chimed again, and the figure moved closer, its hand reaching out, the shadows stretching toward Gideon like claws. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him. But in that moment, he remembered something his father had written. Midnight is when it's here, when it takes you. Midnight wasn't just a time. It was a door, a moment when the barrier between their world and his was at its weakest. If Gideon could find a way to close it, to seal the clock, maybe, just maybe, he could survive. The clock struck once more, and Gideon made a decision. He would face whatever lay beyond that door, whatever terror the clock had unleashed, and he would find a way to end it. Because if he didn't, he knew there would be no escaping the nightmare, not for him, and not for anyone else. The next few days were a blur of fear and desperation for Gideon. He could barely sleep, each moment of rest marred by the image of the shadowy figure, by the ticking that haunted his dreams and now, it seemed, his waking hours. The clock was relentless. Each night, it would strike midnight, and each time, reality would begin to warp, pulling him into that dark, twisted realm. He knew he couldn't face it alone. He needed help, someone who might understand what he was up against, someone who could offer him a way out of this nightmare. It was then that he remembered Evelyn. She was a local historian, known for her knowledge of old artifacts and the stories they carried. She had a reputation for being both curious and unafraid of the strange and supernatural. Gideon reached out to her, barely able to hide the tremor in his voice as he explained the situation. He felt foolish, like a man admitting to being afraid of his own shadow, but Evelyn didn't dismiss him. Instead, there was a moment of silence on the line before she responded, her voice heavy with something between concern and fear. "I know what you're talking about. You need to come here, immediately." Gideon didn't waste any time. He arrived at Evelyn's house, an old, creaky place filled with books and artifacts that seemed to hum with their own quiet energy. She led him to her study, where the walls were lined with shelves crammed full of dusty tomes and ancient curiosities. She listened as Gideon recounted his encounters, the dreams, the clock, the shadow, and as he spoke, he noticed her face grow paler. When he finished, she opened one of her books, a thick, leather-bound volume, and flipped to a page marked with a piece of tattered ribbon. There, on the yellowed parchment, was a drawing of the clock. Evelyn explained that the clock was known as the Midnight Gate, a relic from a long-forgotten ritual meant to keep something at bay. It was a vessel, she said, a doorway to a place beyond human comprehension, and the carvings were meant to seal it, to keep whatever lay on the other side from crossing over. But the binding had been damaged, and now the entity that had held back was trying to break free, using Gideon as the key. Evelyn's eyes were dark as she spoke, her words laced with a fear that Gideon had not seen in her before. "The clock feeds on your fear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time it strikes 12, it weakens the boundary between our world and theirs. If it succeeds, there will be no turning back." Gideon felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He asked her if there was a way to stop it, to seal the clock once more, and Evelyn hesitated before handing him an old, rusted key. It was small, almost fragile-looking, with strange symbols carved into its surface, symbols that matched those on the clock. "This key," she said, "was part of the original ritual. It might be enough to lock the gate again, but you have to be there when it strikes 12. You have to face it, without fear. If you let it take you, even for a moment, the door will open, and nothing will stop it." The weight of her words pressed down on Gideon as he took the key. He had never felt more afraid. The thought of facing the clock, of confronting the shadowy figure that haunted his dreams, filled him with a dread that clawed at his insides. But he knew he had no choice. If he ran, if he tried to ignore it, the clock would continue its work, and eventually, he would find another way to break free. He had to end it, and he had to do it tonight. As midnight approached, Gideon returned to his workshop, the key clutched tightly in his hand. The workshop was dark, the air heavy and still, the silence broken only by the faint ticking that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He could feel the presence of the clock even before he saw it, a weight in the room that drew his gaze. It stood against the far wall, its face illuminated by the faint light of a single, flickering bulb. The hands were moving slowly but steadily, inching their way toward 12. Gideon felt his heart begin to race, fear clawing at the edges of his resolve. He stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the stillness, and as he approached, the air grew colder, his breath misting in front of him. He could hear the whispers again, faint but growing louder with each step, and he knew that the shadow was near. He reached the clock, his fingers brushing against its surface, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The whispers ceased, the air stilled, and then the clock struck 12. The sound was deafening, a gong that reverberated through the workshop, shaking the very walls. The light flickered, then went out, plunging Gideon into darkness. He could feel the presence behind him, the cold breath of the shadow on his neck, the sensation of something reaching for him, and he forced himself to turn, the key held out before him. The figure was there, its form barely visible in the dark, but its eyes, two pinpricks of light, bore into his, filled with malice and hunger. Gideon took a deep breath, his hand shaking, and he stepped toward the figure. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, each one echoing his fears, his failures, telling him to run, to give in. But he didn't. He focused on the key, on the symbols carved into its surface, and with every ounce of willpower, he pushed forward, closing the distance between himself and the shadow. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in on him, and he could feel his fear rising, threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't let it. He had to be strong, had to face it without fear. He reached the figure, his hand plunging the key into its chest, and for a moment, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the cold lifted, and the darkness seemed to shatter, light flooding the workshop. Gideon gasped, his knees buckling as the figure dissolved into smoke, the key falling from his hand to the floor with a metallic clink. The clock was silent, its hands frozen at midnight, and for the first time in days, Gideon felt the weight lift from his chest. He had faced the darkness, and he had won. But as he looked down at the key, now lying motionless at his feet, he knew that this was far from over. The clock was silent for now, but the fear remained, and somewhere, deep within its gears, something was still waiting. Midnight had become a time Gideon dreaded with every fiber of his being. Despite everything he had done, despite facing the shadow and using the key Evelyn had given him, he knew the fight wasn't over. The clock had fallen silent for days, yet the dread lingered, an unshakable feeling that something still lurked just beyond the edges of reality, waiting for him. It was the kind of feeling that gnawed at the corners of his mind, making every shadow seem deeper, every sound echo longer than it should. On the seventh night, Gideon found himself drawn back to the workshop once more, the ticking in his mind growing louder as midnight approached. The key now hung around his neck on a leather cord, a heavy reminder of what he had faced and what still awaited him. The workshop was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his ears strain for any noise, any sign of life. He could feel the weight of the clock even before he saw it, a dark presence that seemed to press against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The clock stood in the shadows, the brass pendulum hanging perfectly still. Gideon took a deep breath, forcing himself to step closer. He knew this was it, the final confrontation. He could feel it in his bones, a sense that whatever was behind the midnight chime was ready to cross over, ready to claim him for good. He had to end it here, tonight, or it would consume him entirely. The hands of the clock were moving again, slowly but inexorably, toward 12. Each second felt like an eternity, the air around him growing colder, the shadows thickening until they seemed almost solid, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, a low, guttural whisper echoed through the room, a voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Gideon, you cannot escape." The voice was deep, almost inhuman, and it sent a chill down his spine. The pendulum began to move, swinging back and forth, and with each swing, the room seemed to shift, the walls bending and stretching, as if the space itself was being pulled into some dark void. Gideon felt the ground beneath him begin to tremble, the vibrations moving up through his legs, and the sense of impending doom threatened to crush him. The clock struck midnight. The chime was louder than ever before, a deafening gong that reverberated through the workshop, shaking the very foundation of the building. The light above flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He could feel it. The presence, the entity that had been waiting, now free. It was behind him, and he could hear it moving, the scrape of something heavy dragging across the floor, the sharp intake of breath that sounded too close, too real. Gideon spun around, the key in his hand, its cold metal biting into his palm. The shadow was there, taller, more defined, its shape almost solid now. Its eyes were glowing faintly, twin orbs of malice and hunger, and the air around it seemed to warp, bending toward the darkness that it emanated. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at Gideon, and he felt an invisible force wrap around his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs, pulling him toward the clock. The whisper came again, echoing through the room, the words dripping with venom. "You are mine, Gideon," just as he was. Gideon's eyes widened, realization dawning on him with a horror that threatened to shatter his resolve. The entity had taken his father. That was why his father had been so afraid, why he had tried to warn him. The curse of the clock had been passed down, binding itself to their family, and now it wanted Gideon. He struggled against the force, his feet sliding across the floor as he was pulled closer and closer to the clock, the key glowing faintly in his hand. He knew what he had to do. The key was meant to seal the clock, to bind whatever lay beyond it, but he had to do it from within. He had to cross the threshold, to confront the darkness head-on, and seal it from the other side. It was the only way. The realization filled him with a cold dread, but there was no other choice. He had to end this, once and for all, even if it meant sacrificing himself. With a final, desperate effort, Gideon lunged forward, plunging the key into the face of the clock. The world exploded in light and sound, a blinding flash that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality apart. The shadows screamed, the sound a high-pitched wail that made Gideon's ears ring, and he felt himself falling, pulled into the darkness that lay beyond the clock. The air was cold, an unnatural chill that cut to the bone, and he could see nothing, only the void, endless and empty. But the key was still in his hand, and it was glowing brighter now, a beacon in the darkness. Gideon could feel the presence around him, the entity's rage palpable, a storm of hatred that swirled through the void. It lashed out at him, the force of it like a physical blow, and he gritted his teeth, holding the key tighter, focusing all his willpower on the symbols carved into its surface. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the entity knew what he was about to do, and the shadows closed in, wrapping around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. With a final, desperate cry, Gideon thrust the key forward, and the darkness shattered. The void seemed to implode, the shadows pulled back into the clock, and the cold lifted, replaced by a warmth that spread through his entire body. The light grew brighter, blinding him, and then silence. Gideon awoke on the floor of his workshop, the clock lying in pieces beside him, its face shattered, the pendulum still. The key was gone, and the air was still. The oppressive weight that had filled the room now lifted. He could barely move, his body aching, his mind foggy, but he knew he had done it. The entity was gone, sealed away, and the clock was nothing more than a broken relic. But as he lay there, catching his breath, his eyes fell on the shards of the clock's face, and he felt a chill run down his spine. There, among the pieces, was a faint symbol, carved into the glass, a symbol that he recognized, a symbol that meant binding, but also waiting. The nightmare was over for now, but deep down, Gideon knew that some things could never truly be destroyed. The clock had been broken, but the darkness remained, waiting for the day when it could find a way back. Gideon sat in the workshop, surrounded by the remnants of the shattered clock. The air had an eerie stillness, an emptiness that felt unnatural, like the calm after a storm, a silence that was almost too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. His body was sore, each movement sending sharp pangs through his muscles, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the unsettling feeling that gnawed at his insides. He had faced the entity, he had used the key, and he had broken the clock, but something still felt wrong. He stared at the shards of the clock's face, his eyes fixed on the faint symbol etched into the glass. It was almost imperceptible, but Gideon knew it was there. A binding rune, meant to hold something in place, but also a mark of waiting for the right moment to return. The cold realization sent a shiver down his spine, and he couldn't shake the sense that, despite everything he had done, the nightmare was far from over. He could still feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the edges of his consciousness, watching, waiting for the right time. As he stood up, Gideon noticed something else. Among the shattered pieces of wood and glass lay a fragment of the pendulum, its surface covered in scratches. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the jagged lines, and his breath caught in his throat. The scratches formed words, rough and barely legible, but unmistakable. "It will come again." A chill spread through him, a creeping dread that made his skin prickle. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been banished, forced back to wherever it had come from. And now, it was waiting for another opportunity, another way to cross over. Gideon's gaze drifted around the workshop, the shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far, the corners that seemed darker than they should be. He could almost hear it, the faintest whisper, an echo of the voices that had haunted his dreams, the promise that it wasn't over. He knew he had to be vigilant, that he could never truly let his guard down, because the entity would find a way. It always had, and it always would. The key was gone, but the clock's essence remained, embedded in the very fabric of his reality. He turned away from the broken clock, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the workshop. He couldn't let this happen to anyone else. He had to find a way to end it, to destroy the entity for good, but how? The answers were elusive, slipping through his fingers like smoke, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, he felt truly helpless. The knowledge that the entity was still out there, that it could still reach him, filled him with a sense of foreboding that refused to leave. The journey was not over. He had only taken the first step. Gideon gathered the shards of the clock, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed them in a box. He sealed it tightly, locking away the pieces, but even as he did, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The entity wasn't just in the clock. It was in him now, a part of his life that he could never fully escape. It was there, in the shadows, in the silence, in the dark corners of his mind. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and turned off the lights in the workshop, the darkness swallowing the room as he walked away. As he reached the doorway, Gideon paused, his hand resting on the frame. He looked back, his eyes scanning the darkness, the cold stillness of the workshop. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shifted, a presence that seemed to watch him from the corner of the room. He blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling remained, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the stillness, and he knew that this was far from the end. The clock may be broken, but the time will come again. The words echoed in his mind, a reminder that the entity was still out there, waiting, and that one day it would return. Gideon knew he had to be ready, that the battle was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. He needed answers, a way to truly destroy the darkness, and he would find it, no matter how long it took. But until then, he would live with the knowledge that the shadows were never far away, that the clock's chime would echo again, and that he would have to face the darkness once more. And so, as Gideon walked away, the darkness of the workshop settled in, the shadows deepening, the faintest whisper echoing through the silence, a promise, a warning, a threat. The story wasn't over, and somewhere, deep within the shattered remains of the clock, something waited, patient and hungry, for the time when it would strike again. If you felt the same chill that Gideon did, if you can still hear the ticking in the silence of the night, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This story isn't over, and the next time the clock strikes, you won't want to miss it. Leave your theories in the comments. How do you think Gideon can end this for good? And remember, when midnight comes, keep an eye on the shadows, because some clocks never truly stop ticking.